the welfare and decision-making of the poor. Her research highlights the role of networks and peers in shaping economic decisions and develops new empirical methods in this context. Professor Prina is co-editor of Labor Economics, a faculty affiliate of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor, a research affiliate at Innovations for Poverty Action, an invited researcher at Jayapal for the Inclusive Financial Innovation Initiative, and a faculty scholar at the Institute for Health, Equity, and Social Justice Research. She's the graduate program director of the PhD in Applied Economics. She holds a PhD in economics from Boston University. Prior to joining us here at Northeastern 2018, Professor Prina held positions as associate and assistant professor of economics at Case Western Reserve University and as a research scholar at the Inter-American Development Bank. Well, I'm so happy to have her here and to share her work with us. She is an innovative scholar and thinker and likes to jump into new areas and new fields. We're so looking forward to having her share her work with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So what I'm presenting today is somewhat like out of like my two large fields of like expertise. And I was telling Angel, this was like, this started like with a discussion like with my twin girls who are 8 years old 2 years ago. Because we live in Brookline and we were walking to school, and all around school there were these signs that were saying like stop Asian hate. And they told me like, Mommy, why do they say hate everywhere when we are not allowed to use the word hate in school? And so we started like talking about this, and then talking with like a few colleagues at Northeastern who have like a spouse or a partner that's in the works like in the hospital setting. Like they were telling me that during the pandemic, they had a few instances in which they were like, unfortunately, like discriminated. So I'm not a labor economist by training, but I started talking like to a friend and coder of mine, like Kaveh Majlesi, who's a labor economist and does discrimination, as well as to a few other people that do labor discrimination, asking them if in the realm of labor discrimination, there were any studies that actually like documented the effect of like political rhetoric and racial bias on the overall like well-being of certain minorities when there is a rhetoric against them. And so the research that there is about like the role of like media propaganda and political rhetoric, at least like from a standpoint of like economics, is mostly about the fact that when there are like such rhetorics, these can have effect that are like negative in terms of like xenophobic actions and violence. Radio propaganda in Rwanda as well as in Germany are famous paper, like then unfortunate tweets by our former president, as well as like certain types of like political campaigns. But most of the empirical evidence, at least like within the economics realm, focuses on acts of violence that are generated or caused by political propaganda. There is like no effect, like, or no study that actually focuses on the overall well-being of minorities. And so the key idea of like these papers, and there is a paper by Leo Bernstein and co-author that actually says, well, if we think about like rhetoric and propaganda, it works like through two channels, two different types of. It changes the view of people that are already prejudiced, but it also changes the view of the unprejudiced people. And so, unfortunately, like that's a double effect that then can cause xenophobic actions. In this paper, like what we want to look at is not whether like racial bias and political rhetoric like causes act of violence, because that's already been studied, but we want to go somewhat beyond. And the idea is that, well, clearly, like in the setting that we study, which is like the pandemic, specifically like in the US, there was with the labeling by President Trump of like the COVID-19 virus, the Chinese virus, there was like a media propaganda that was like set forth in terms of like anti-Chinese like rhetoric. And so hate incidents like and crimes targeting like Asian people like actually like reach like unprecedented levels. There are like several associations, including like PI that documents that actually like 1 in 5 Asian American or like people of like Asian backgrounds like living in the US was a victim of different type of like acts of violence. And these are like just self-reported. So it's possible that the rate is actually like higher. So what we do is like we use the fact that, I mean, the pandemic was exogenous, combined with the fact that it ignites additional anti-Chinese like rhetoric to actually like study the effects on one specific like minority group, which is like Asians in the US labor market. And so essentially like what we want to be able to study is if these anti-Chinese rhetoric had any effect that was different for Asian minorities in the US versus like other racial / like ethnic group. I should say here that in the census, we're able to distinguish like, and I will be talking about like different racial group, although that's not a precise term. So I'll be talking about Blacks, Hispanics, Asian, and then the remaining or like control category is essentially like white non-Hispanics. But Hispanics is an ethnicity, but it becomes like too lengthy to then say like racial or ethnicity. Okay, so this is essentially like what we do. And unfortunately, like, I mean, it's a good, natural, though unfortunate, like experiment that we studied. So what we want to see is whether the employment status, and I'm going to start with that, and then like the earnings of Asian, along with other people like of different backgrounds, change from this before the pandemic with respect like to afterwards. And the idea is, and what we try to put forward like in our paper is that the key channel is this increased distaste towards Asian. And so what we'll try to investigate after I show you like the first set of results is whether like that's actually like our driving channel. So when we were about to start like this analysis, a few people that study like labor market discrimination, like in the US labor market, were telling me like, oh, but Silvia, like Asians are like such an uninteresting category because they're the overperformers. Essentially, like if you look at this graph, like before the pandemic, in violet are like it's unemployment of like Asians, then green is white, then it's Hispanic in red, and then it's black in blue. And as you can see, Asians are the overperformers in the sense that their unemployment rate is always below the one of whites, and actually like their earnings are also higher than any of the other like races or ethnicity. And therefore it's somewhat considered like a not so interesting group. And if you look at the labor discrimination like literature, most of the focus is on the black and white gender gap or like male versus like female. However, if you look at what happened like to Asian unemployment like during the pandemic, you can see that while Asian was like right below the one of white, then like during the pandemic, like there is this spike for all groups, but then for Asian, it actually like goes, unemployment of Asian increases more than the one for white. And then we have like a thick period of time, and still like even like nowadays, if we look at it, it has like a much it has higher levels of unemployment. And we believe that looking at unemployment is a very important nature. It has been well documented in economics as well as like many other fields. What are like, there are plenty of like negative effects associated with like unemployment, from like mental health to actual like physical health, like divorce rates, parenting, and so on and so forth. So we use a few data sources. Our main data source is like the current population survey. It's a large and nationally representative like survey. It's a panel. So essentially like a household is going to be like interviewed like for 4 months, and then let alone for an additional 8, and then interviewed again for an additional like 4 months, which means that we are able to see individuals like before the pandemic and then like during the pandemic. And for certain individuals, we're going to be able to see them during the pandemic like multiple times. I'll explain maybe this like a little better later. And so then we also use like the 2016 presidential election data, which will be able like to tell us like what were like states that voted more in favor of like Trump, which we call like red states, and blue states. So we collapse the data like at the state level, and we develop like quartiles. So we have like red states are the one in the top quartile in terms of like fraction of the population that voted for President Trump, and blue states are the one in the bottom quartile. And then we have supportive evidence from like Nationscape, that is a nationally representative like study run by UCLA about like the electorate. The 2 questions that we're going to be looking at are a little bit like scary, if you ask me, because it asks people about the electorate views, depending on whether they are like they self-report themselves as like Trump voters or like Fox News like watchers. But the reason why I found, I mean, for us the question is important, but the reason why I find the question a little scary is because, as you'll see, it asks like people whether like you have unfavorable view towards like other minorities. And so just the way it's framed, I think it's not very nice in my opinion. Okay. So in terms of like the sample and the time frame, the way in which we look at this is like we look at all the individuals that are included in our sample like before, that have it, for which we have at least like 1 observation before the pandemic starts and 1 observation like after. And so what this means is that we have a pre-pandemic period that goes like from January 2019 until like February 2020, and then and then a pandemic period that goes like from April 2020 until like April 2021. Let me tell you how essentially like this works. This must be, this is too small for you to see. But essentially like if we consider like a cohort, let's take like the one that's labeled like January 2019. That cohort is labeled January 2019 because essentially we have like that person that gets interviewed for the first time in January 2019, and then she'll be interviewed also like in February, March, and April 2019. And so April 2019 is the last period in which we're going to be able to see that person before the pandemic. And then we observe that person again in April 2020. That's the month like after like the pandemic. For people that say get interviewed like in September 2019, then we're going to be able to see that person like September, October, November, and December. So December 2019 is the month that we consider like the pre-pandemic month. And then we'll observe that person for a total of 4 times during the pandemic, which is going to be in September, October, November, and December of like 2020. So we just need 1 information before the pandemic, and then we are able like, we run the analysis like in 2 ways. So we consider like in the analysis that I'm going to show you like the data, all of the observation like post-pandemic, but we can also do like just the like year-to-year like comparison and just have like 1 observation pre and 1 observation during the pandemic for all the observation in the sample. So then the idea is that we are going to we're going to look at the probability that conditional on you being employed before the pandemic, you become like unemployed. That's essentially like our key variable like for unemployment. And then the other very important like explanatory variable that we're going to be using is what we consider like face-to-face interaction. So we said already that we want to be able to analyze the effect of like your probability of becoming unemployed if you are Asian or like Black or Hispanic or white, non-Hispanic. But then the other characteristics that we are interested in is like if these unemployment, to see whether like this unemployment is caused by distaste. And therefore, like the idea here is that if you are involved in any kind of like face-to-face like occupation, being Asian, then the effect coming out of being like the probability of becoming unemployed would increase. And so we measure like face-to-face interaction in two different ways. I'm going to show you first the result like with our first measure, but I need to be like very upfront about the fact that the first measure, while being like very detailed, it can also like be problematic. So face-to-face occupations like is measured in the CPS survey by a question that was asked like to employees in terms of like their ability like to work like remotely, right? And so if an occupation was recorded by workers that were employed like as an occupation in which they were allowed like to work remotely, and then depending on the number of hours, then we would build essentially like a variable that would be like below median remote, above median remote, meaning that you divide the population or like a given occupation by enabling you like to do some work at least like remotely, and other occupation has not been able like to do so. Nevertheless, like there is a big weakness of this variable that is associated with the fact that this question was asked like to people in the CPS survey that were employed. And therefore one might be saying like, well, the measure is very precise, but it could be endogenous because it depends on the employment it's conditional on the employment of the people that are interviewed. And so we also measure this in a different way, which is we code people by being in a face-to-face occupation if they are like in 2 out of the 7 industries that are coded like in the CPS, which is retail and personal services, and if they have a level of occupation that is like high school or less. And that is because there are like several studies that have been done like using the CPS data that document that most of the face-to-face like occupation are done by people that work in these 2 industries, retail and personal services, and that have like very low amount of skills. So the difference would be in between like say a computer software programmer that works like in retail and that is in charge of like designing like the online shopping of a given like store, while instead the person actually like working on the floor in a certain specific store. So just very quickly in terms of like descriptive statistics by race, what I want to point out is that, well, if we look at Asian, clearly like they're the one that appear to have like the most educated of like the 4 race and ethnicities. They're also the one for which like earnings are higher. In terms of industry, there isn't anything specific that you could point out in terms of like the specific industry in which they're in. But in terms of like redness quartiles, like Asians are more likely to be in blue states as opposed like to red states, and the same can be said of like Hispanics. In terms of like the census region, which were given like by the CPS, you can also see that they are more likely to be in the West, and along with Black and Hispanics, they're also like less likely to be in the South. Okay, so our goal in the empirical analysis are like twofold. First, I'm going to show you like the effect of like just being of a given, like belonging to a given minority on unemployment caused by the pandemic. And then I'll be looking at the effect of like belonging to a given minority and also working in a face-to-face occupation on your likelihood of becoming unemployed. So this is like how the first type of like regression would work like. So this is like the probability of becoming unemployed, and here are like the dummies for being Asian or Black or Hispanics. Our like comparison group is going to be like non-Hispanic white. And then The second specification, which is actually like our main specification, is the one that aside from having like race and being in an occupation that is more likely to be face-to-face, it also includes like the interaction between the two, so that we're going to be able like to see whether Asian in face-to-face occupation were more likely to become unemployed. Okay, so this is like the very first regression. We look at Asian, Blacks, and Hispanics. Again, comparison characteristics is white. And as you can see, like all three minorities are actually like negatively impacted by the pandemic, meaning that they're more likely to become unemployed post-pandemic. What's interesting though is that then if you belong to a more face-to-face occupation, you're also more likely to become unemployed, which also like makes sense. And then finally, like when we do the interaction with Asian and people that belong like to more face-to-face occupation, you can see that the effect, it's there for Asian. So Asian that work in more in occupation that are more likely to be face-to-face are much more likely, 7.3 percentage point more likely to become like unemployed. But if you look at the other minorities that work in face-to-face occupation, which are like Blacks and Hispanics, there is no effect for them. And this effect is actually like large and statistically significant. Next, one might be saying like, well, but Silvia, like you pointed out earlier that Asians are like much more likely to be educated, that Asians are much more likely like to live in the West. So is it possible that this can simply be explained by some kind of like sorting? So in particular, like the first thing that we look at is if there is any kind of like geographical sorting, meaning that are these differences, like can these differences be explained, or like do they go away once essentially like I add some kind of like variable that controls for geographical sorting, meaning at the very least like state fixed effects. And as you can see, like the effect stays there and like doesn't even change in terms of like precision. Then the next thing that we can look at is also in column 5 and in column 6. It's also what we call like industry sorting. So we know that Asians are more likely to be employed in certain type of like industries versus like others, and therefore like the CPS data allows you to control up until the level of like 3-digit industries. So the 1-digit industry is just like the 7 industry that include like personal services and retail, and then you can go like to finer and finer like level. Just because this is a question that I get often is, can you distinguish between essential workers versus not? Unfortunately, we cannot do that, meaning that they did not change the coding like during the pandemic for consistency with respect like to the past. And so what this means is that when you look at nurses, even it's impossible like to be able like to divide like nurses that say like could work like remotely on the remote like appointment online versus like nurses that say like work in the ER or like NICU and ICU and absolutely like needed to be there. So we can't do that type of distinction. Nevertheless, like it's reassuring that column 4 that adds like the state fixed effects and 5 and 6 that add additional like digit industries like we don't find like any changes like in our interaction coefficient between like Asian and face-to-face occupation, because essentially like this is telling us that there aren't any kind of like geographical sorting, or there is no like industry sorting across like different type of like social groups. Something that I did not show you is that something else that could be going on is the fact that say like Asian have a different level of like risk aversion, either because death rates are say like higher, we control for death rates in our specification and the effects are no different. The other thing that there could be is that they have like a much lower or much higher like risk tolerance that then could affect the fact that say like they essentially like were not laid off, but quit their jobs. But there are, we don't have in the
Silvia?
CPS.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So if they quit their jobs, then they are not unemployed anymore. They are they are out of the labor force,
Yeah.
right?
So we
So
include.
if they say I'm looking for a job, unless they are looking to change a job, it would be automatically. They would just be out of the labor force if they're not looking for a job, right?
Yeah, there are very few people like in the sample that actually like quit their jobs to start with. We don't have in the data directly like a measure, like, so the CPS does not ask, I mean, it's a labor survey, so it does not ask people like for like their risk aversion versus like other like time preferences and other stuff that economists are always very interested in. So what we do is we actually look at the survey on global preferences survey by Falk and co-authors, like to try to see whether like risk tolerance of Asian is different than others, but it seems to be like very, very close. Also, like there are no, so the fraction of people that quit their job is overall very small, and there are no significant differences between Asian versus like other minorities. Okay, so then next what we put forward is the idea that there could be like essentially like a role for public opinion. And the idea here is that essentially like if this is driven by some kind of like this state discrimination that was put forward by certain like political leaders that started using like the name Chinese virus, and that was amplified by other news channels and so on, then we could find some effect like across like the political spectrum, right? And so then the idea is that when we look at red states versus like blue states, we should be able like to find like a difference, right? Particularly like if this was something that started with the labeling of Chinese virus and then was amplified by other political leaders and news channels. So our hypothesis is that states that voted like more favorably like for President Trump should show like stronger negative effects associated with our interaction coefficient of like Asians working like in face-to-face occupation. And so what we look at, we divide, as I mentioned earlier, like our states in red states versus like blue states, and then we have like the two middle quartiles, like we pull them together, and we run the same type of regression. So as you can see here, kind of like the not so good news is that there is an effect still there, even like in blue states, which is somewhat in line with a lot of anecdotal news that was saying that even like in states such as like New York, like New York City, as well as like in Boston, there were quite a few episodes of like anti-Asian violence, but the effects, like as you can see, like gets like stronger the stronger the more we move like towards like red states. And so this is somewhat like supportive evidence of the fact that there appears to be some kind of like political rhetoric channels like behind these findings of Asians working in face-to-face occupation being more likely to be unemployed. The other supportive evidence that we have is that we can use data, as I mentioned, like from Nationscape, to actually like look at whether Trump voters and Fox News watcher were viewing Asian like more unfavorably than other races. And particularly like this is like the very good for us, but I think like very unfortunate wording in terms of like a question, ask like how favorably is your impression of Asian? Very favorable Asians, very favorable, somewhat unfavorable, very unfavorable, or haven't heard enough. And so what we do is that we combine like the unfavorable categories like into one, and then like create a dummy variable. This is a survey that takes like a different sample, like representative sample of the US electorate, like on a monthly basis. So then we take like monthly averages. We do the same because the survey asks the same, like for Black and Latinos. And Therefore, like we need to be aware that the sample like changes month to month, but also changes depending on the question, meaning that if you are Black, then I can ask you about Latinos and Asians, but I will not ask you like about Blacks and then so on. We've run, I'm gonna show you like the figures like in which like essentially we have a different sample like every time. We've also run the same figure like just for whites, non-Hispanic whites, and the results do not change. And then I'm gonna show you like some regression results as well. So this is like unfavorable view of Asians by voter type. So in gray, we have, in black, we have Trump voters. In gray, we have non-Trump voters. And in very light gray, we have everybody. And as you can see, these are the months like before the pandemic, so October, November, and December. And then we have like the during pandemic period. And as you can see, there is like a big jump, especially like for Trump voter, but also for non-Trump voter, which is in line with the fact that we still find a positive and statistically significant result when in the regression that I showed you earlier, when we look even at blue states, right? So even though this is a different survey, it's still like supportive evidence that is very much like in line with what we observed earlier. When we look at Blacks, I mean, you can look at whatever voter type, Trump voter, non-Trump voter, and everybody, and there is no difference like to be detected before the pandemic versus like during. The same thing if we look like at Latinos, there also appear like to be no specific trends. Next, what we have is Fox News viewership. So again, the idea here being that if we think about this being like the channel of like political rhetoric, like being the one that actually like pushes this like racial bias further and then causes this effect on the US labor market, as we can see here, also like the effect it's there like for Fox News viewers when we consider Asian with respect to before the pandemic versus like during the pandemic. However, when we look at Blacks or Hispanics, there is no difference when we consider like the before and after. So it seems really that the effect is stemming from Fox viewers and Trump voters, but more than the rest of the electorate. But also it seems that it's just there for one specific minority that is Asian, and it's not there for the other ones. Here are also like the regressions, which allow us like to control a little better for like characteristics that we have on the sample by nationscape. And as you can see, like, again, there is virtually like no effect when we look at Blacks and Latinos. However, there is a strong and statistically significant effect for like Trump voters and Fox News watchers like during the pandemic for Asians. So next, as I mentioned, like the idea that we are using a question that is asked in the CPS survey to people that kept being employed is introducing or might be introducing like some bias like in our estimates, particularly like if people in certain type of occupation were more likely to lose their jobs than in others, then the variable that we use, the index that we use, could be affected by the pandemic. So non-remoteless like does not perfectly also like predict like if a job has to be performed like face-to-face. For example, like you can take the example of like truck drivers versus like taxi drivers. Both of the two jobs cannot be performed like remotely. However, if you think about truck drivers, they have very little like face-to-face occupation, while face-to-face interaction, while instead taxi drivers have a lot of face-to-face interaction. So one might be saying like, well, maybe like that's also like a reason for which this is not like such a good measure. So as I said earlier, like we use previous literature that documents that it's really like most of the face-to-face occupations are actually like driven by the industries of like retails and personal services, and that are driven by people that have a low level of like education. And so this is something that was like predetermined like before the pandemic, therefore like not endogenous. And when we build like this measure of like face-to-face and we run it instead of the measure that we used previously, there are no differences like in our results. So this is our measure of like face-to-face interacted with Asian. Once again, like very similar like effects. And then when we look at blue states versus like red states, we can also see that the effect is there when we look at blue states, although like not statistically significant, but then it increases in terms of like magnitude moving on like to red states. Okay, finally, like the additional data that we look at are earnings data that are contained like in the CPS. There are a few caveats to be considered like with the earnings data, because there isn't really like a lot that we can do. First of all, like we need to be mindful of the fact that here there is a selection effect, meaning that we can only look at the effects on earning for people that remain employed. We cannot look at the one that clearly like became unemployed during the pandemic. We have a smaller sample size because while for the unemployment data, we can see people 4 times and then 4 times again the year after, for earnings data, we only have like one. Earnings get recorded only like once a year. So we only have like one observation per year per individual. And so they're always like 1 year apart. An additional thing that I need to point out about earnings is that we see the overall earnings. And so there is a fraction of the population that earns like hourly wages, and so for those people we're going to be able like to see hourly wages, but it's a very selected part of our sample. And so we want to look at the representative sample for which we have earnings, and as I believe like most of you are, we have like a monthly wage, right? And so what we can observe is just whether like the wage dropped, and I'm going to be able to tell you like by how much like wage drop, but we are unable like to disentangle unless for that very like selected fraction of like the sample, we are unable to disentangle whether the drop in the wage is due to say like you working like less hours or is an actual like hourly wage drop. Okay, so once again, what we want to do is to see whether there was like a change in your monthly earnings right now during the pandemic with respect like to before. And so here what we can see is that like during the pandemic, during the pandemic, like Asians had a drop of about like $25 in terms of like their wage. There was an effect, though not statistically significant, for people that were working in like more face-to-face like occupations. But once we include like the interaction between like Asian working in face-to-face occupation, we can see that the effect is actually like a drop of like 75 lower earnings than whites for Asian working like in face-to-face occupation. And if anything, you can see that Hispanics are not affected. One could even say that it's possible, at least like that's what regressions like signal, that actually like Blacks, so another minority, like somewhat like pick up for the loss in wages of Asian. And in terms of like to somewhat being able like to quantify it is like $75 a month. That's roughly like 8% a week. Sorry, that's roughly like 8% of like weekly earnings. So it's not this small like amount like for these people. These results like stay pretty much the same. Like I mean, you can see that it moves like by about $1 per week, no more. Once we include like additional like digit industries, when we include states, and so on and so forth. So to conclude, political rhetoric can have like a strong impact on like certain like minorities, somewhat like pushing or like having negative effect in terms of like act of violence. But what this paper does is to actually show that political rhetoric, at least like in the context of like the US labor market, can actually have like negative effects that go beyond like acts of violence, but that extend to like unemployment and earnings. So our key findings highlight that, well, it's true, like during the pandemic, like all minorities actually like suffer compared like to non-Hispanic white, but it's only Asians that among those people that work in face-to-face occupation is only Asians the one that like actually like get affected, being more likely to become unemployed, but also like experiencing roughly like an 8% like drop on their earnings. In addition, to support like our channel that really like is like political rhetoric, what's causing these negative effects. The effects are stronger in states that voted more favorably, like for President Trump in the 2016 election, and they're also like more dramatic, like in for those people that self-report themselves as being like either like Fox News watcher, or like Trump voters. And this is it. I don't know if I went too quickly.
Let's open up the floor to questions.
I have some idiot questions because
Can you say who you are?
I'm Lori Lefkowitz, and and numbers always elude me. So I have some really basic questions. The chart where you had the columns, black, white, and yeah. I just wanted to ask you about the measure where it went from point 2 to like what is that percent? What is that number?
This was like percentage. Yeah.
So
I mean,
yeah, that one.
So let's consider this one like for Fox News viewers. I can actually like quantify better like this one. Yeah. So here it goes like from roughly like 10% of the electorate viewing like Asians like negatively to about like a 15%. So there was an increase by about
10% of
50%.
viewers before this were just admitted they have an unfavorable view. This is very strange to me that that people would just
Yes, I have that.
admit it like that. Yeah. So I mean, I wonder how reliable. I mean, I guess that what's reliable is the change, but how reliable the data is in terms of self-reported prejudice. And my other question, also very, very basic, is this word Asian, because you have anti-Chinese rhetoric and then this category of Asian, and I'm not sure who fits into that category. And if you have to look a particular kind of Asian, is there a sort of white prejudice against that lumps a certain features of eyes as opposed to other people on the Asian continent who are also Asian? Is this really all Asians, or is it Asians that Americans confuse for Chinese, like Koreans, Japanese? Like what is this word?
Can I answer her question first? So all like both of them are like really good points. So for the first one, like what we did was actually like we checked that these like percentage change actually like reflects also like in our data, and it seems to be that this percentage change is actually like reflected in our like CPS data. Second, like this is a very like well repeated like survey, and it's like anonymized, and so people like they could lie, but why lie? If anything, there would be like underreporting because you would feel uncomfortable, right? So if anything, unless we worry that say like underreporting decreases, But I would say that if anything, like if we believe like at the paper by Leo Burstyn that I cited like in my very first slide, political rhetoric like might actually have made people that had both prejudice or unprejudiced views like actually more at ease reporting like their unfavorable view. Regarding like the second question, that's an excellent question. I should have pointed this out. So in the CPS, when people like answer the survey, they are just asked like if like to self-report, and that's also so they're asked like to self-report their race and ethnicity, as when you do many other times like in our lives. And so, but you're not within Asian, you're not given like subcategories. So it's just like overall Asian. So I'm with you in terms of saying that, say like, I mean, Southeast Asians look very different, and even like American or myself would be able to say that Southeast Asians are not, they don't
Chinese.
look like Chinese, right? But here they're all together. So these effects should actually like be interpreted as an underestimate. So if we were able like just to put together like in the category of Asian, like all the ones that are actually Asian or that Americans like could confuse somewhat like for like Chinese, then the effect would most likely be like even larger. Because in here we have like people from India, from Bangladesh, like are still Asian, but very different, and for which like these type of like racial bias during the pandemic did not happen.
Do we know that? I guess that's my question. Do we know that there wasn't racial bias against Indians and?
That's not what the anecdotal evidence or like most of like the journal article or like tweet hates like reported. The AAPI did not like report like, I mean, the vast majority of, but by far like 99% of like the reported like incidents were like against like Chinese or people that were confused by Chinese. I have to mention another thing. In the CPS, they actually like, we thought that this was like a baseline characteristics, and therefore like that was not asked every time that you were asked a survey. So I would have thought that if they asked me the first time whether like I identify myself as like Italian, white, I would have like just ticked it once, and then I don't get asked like another like 7 times. As a matter of fact, though, they do. So the CPS asks you like every time. So what we're going to be looking at next is whether because of the pandemic, like Asian people were more likely to actually like once we moved into the pandemic to actually tick the box Asian versus not, and if there was any kind of like strategic decision making in terms of like revealing your identity versus not. Yeah, but I am interested in looking at other type of like data set to try and see whether we can actually not just look at Asian overall, but we can pin down like Chinese or Chinese Korean, like different like regions, because I believe it's important. Yes.
So 2 questions. In terms of Bilgi Erten, economics and international affairs. You know, Trump also said horrible things about Hispanics, and you're showing us that that didn't move the public opinion in a as much of a negative way. Like from this data, that's what we see, is that it was kind of negative and it kind of like stayed negative. So just curious, like why do you think that didn't change despite like all the negative stuff he said during the pandemic about that? And also, I'm also curious about, or did the timing doesn't correspond?
The timing does not correspond. So if we look at, like, I mean, we haven't looked for Hispanic because that's not like our, but for Hispanics, I mean, let's put it this way, like he had different point in times in which it was focusing on different ethnicities at different times.
Yeah.
And once the pandemic, like pre-pandemic, but even like in this period of time, like the vast majority of like tweet and expression against like Hispanics happen like around, before, and right after like the elections. Once like towards the end of like 2019, I will have to check, but I think that the frequency about like the wall and so on had somewhat like faded away, because this was like 3 years into like him like being elected. And once the pandemic exploded, it became like really like second order. Yeah.
And the second question I had was about sort of the transitions, like when you look at transition from employed to unemployed, and then, you know, transition from employed to some people might have not even looked for a job, like let's say like somebody laid them all off and then they became not in the labor force. And maybe there were some people who were like unemployed and they would have been employed in the pandemic if, you know, the pandemic hadn't happened. So, you know, you could take maybe like a bigger sample and look at all the different types of transitions. And I wonder if that would also help kind of understand like the broader transition metrics.
Yeah. So there is like so unemployment in the US is like relatively like small. And out of the labor force, like it's even smaller. And therefore, like our first go-to place was like looking at people that were employed and looking essentially like at from conditional on being employed, like becoming unemployed. It's true that there are like other transitions, and whether like that decreases, like if you're already unemployed, are you less likely to even be looking for a job? Like if you're Asian, could be, but then like we don't know which type of job you might be looking for and whether that is like face-to-face versus not. And so it somewhat like adds like that unobservable, and that's why we didn't look at that. Okay.
I think there's an online question.
Oh, sorry.
Please. Michelle.
Hi. Hi, Silvia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much first for doing research focusing on Chinese or Asian group. As a Chinese and I think I'm experiencing this kind of discrimination during the pandemic. So I really appreciate your work. Yes, I have a one question. Is you mentioned that you're using linear probability model, right? So the dependent variable. Can I ask you what the dependent variable?
The dependent variable was conditional on being unemployed. What was the probability that you become unemployed?
Okay, so the first question is why do you use LPM instead of logit or probit model here?
We ran them like with the other models. I believe that some of the referee asked us, and there are like no big like differences in terms of like the result. Would you have any preferred like specification?
Okay. And for this specific model, you of course you include all the people in the sample, right? Not only those employed.
We include we condition on being employed, and then we look at whether they become more likely to become unemployed. Yeah, so we don't look, as Bilge was saying, we don't look at all the different transition. We just look at the people that are employed before the pandemic, and then we look at whether they are more likely to become unemployed.
Okay, so but before in the first round of survey, and they mentioned that they're employed, and after like 4 months, the second round of interview, they mentioned that, for example, some of them are unemployed, right? You include all of them.
Yes.
But only for the following, I think the third model, that you only include those people who are employed, right? To gather earning data.
Yeah, in the earning data, yeah, of course, because otherwise, if they become unemployed, their earning goes to zero. And so we just want to look at the change in earnings, not going like from X amount to zero. So that wouldn't make sense.
That's intensive margin.
Yeah, that's intensive margin. Yes.
Okay, thank you. My other question is like for Asian, for Chinese, for example, for different immigration status, they have different opinions about, about Donald Trump. So if your further study include this more specified like ethnicity, please differentiate, between people who are green card holders and not green card holders, because they have totally different opinions. Totally different political opinions.
Yeah, but I mean, that would be like the effect is coming from like, even though we have very few people like in the survey that actually like quit their jobs. So most of the effect is really like from distaste, either related like directly like from the employer not liking Chinese or like Asian minorities, or it's stemming from employers being worried that having like a lot of people that are working face to face like within like their own like shop or companies that are Asian, then they're going to be losing customers, right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Silvia.
Alex?
Alex Jakubowski. I just had a quick question on the intensive margin, actually.
Yeah.
So what's the interpretation there, that the employers are paying them less, $75 less?
So we don't, as I mentioned earlier, like we don't know our, like we can't, we don't have hourly wages for everybody. So when we include like, say, like take people, I don't know, like myself, we don't, like for me, you would only be able like to observe like my wage before and after, and I have a monthly wage and I can convert it for everybody on a weekly wage, right? But given that I don't earn an hourly wage, then when I get asked like, is this wage like hourly, I say no, and then I don't get asked like the question about like the hourly wage, okay? So we don't know, so then if you see a decrease like in your wage, that could be due to you working instead of like 40 hours, 30 hours, or it could be due like to you actually being paid less per hour. So we don't know whether this drop in earnings, in other words, is is coming from your employer paying you less per hours, or your employer asking you to work less hours. So I can't tell you which of the two it is. But anyway, like so the key point is you're being paid less. We don't know whether it's because you work 40 hours and less money, or if you work less than 40 hours. That
Can
I
you
can't
see
tell.
who's changed jobs?
We could see who change job if at least like they change job like from one industry to another. Yeah.
I want to thank Dr. Prina for sharing her work with us. And just to let everyone know, November 13th, Dr. Isabel Martinez will be presenting in plain sight. She was with us here earlier, 50-ish years of Latinx comedy in New York City. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please take food.
Just start paying people that stuff. I can't
Well, if they
suddenly.
switch jobs, if they like
Yes.
were forced to leave, and
Yes.
then they.
You can
the-
demote
the
people,
only
or you
available
can force
option.
them into, yes. Jobs. It was not open as much. Right.
So people really might work less hours, yeah.
If you like
Less
work
hours.
for Amazon warehouse, they can't reduce your pay.